There's a point during the second episode of Timber Wars, the episode about old growth forests, where we mentioned something called the mycorrhizal network. But we didn't get into it because it's so complex and mind boggling that it really needed its own episode. Well, we thought we'd bring you that episode, in a way. Suzanne Simard is one of the leading scientists who has dug into this underground network of roots and fungi dubbed the Wood Wide Web. Her groundbreaking research revealing that trees share resources and even communicate with each other has spread into popular culture. It's inspired everything from the giant tree in the movie Avatar to the scientist character in Richard Powers' book The Overstory. Now Suzanne has a book of her own out called Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. And I leapt at the chance to interview her for her book launch event at Powell's Books. We wanted to share the conversation with you because it might explode the way you see the trees towering over your head and the soil beneath your feet. It was recorded live over Zoom before an audience from around the country, and we weave in some of their questions throughout. I'd love to begin with the way you begin the book. That your very first line is, "For generations, my family has made its living cutting down forests." And I was curious if you'd introduce us a little bit to your family history and why you wanted to start this book about trees by saying you come from a long line of loggers.
Well, yeah, I grew up, as I write in my book, I grew up in the forest. And my family, which had emigrated from France in the late 1800s, eventually moved across Canada, but they stopped in Quebec and lived there for quite a long time and logged. They were horse loggers there, and then moved west and ended up in British Columbia, and settled in an area, what we call the inland rainforest. And my great grandfather and my grandfather and my uncles and my dad, they all became horse loggers. And so that's how I grew up, just in that environment. And it was our way of life. And I got to know trees in a really intimate way, just watching them and being around them.
And soil too, right down to the flavors is
Yeah, well, some of the first photos of me, I have a mouthful of dirt and worms. And so, yeah, so I had this early attraction to soil. And of course, when we lived at Maple Lake and we lived on a houseboat that my Uncle Jack had built for logging. And there was an outhouse, of course, off the gangplank on the shore. And that also gave me a great opportunity to learn more about soil since, as I write in my book, our dog fell in the outhouse, and that gave me a whole world, or this whole view of the soil under our feet.
and I look forward to delving into that soil a little bit. But right out of college, your first job was kind of following in your family's footsteps and getting into the world of logging. And the company you went to work for, as you write, you weren't just the only woman employee, you were the first woman employee they had ever hired, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess maybe just take us back to that time a little bit, and what kind of work were you doing, and how did foresters see forests, especially the old ones at the time?
Yeah, so when I started with that forest company, it was the late 1970s, and then in the early 80s. I continued working for them for a few years. And yeah, I was the only girl there. And so first of all, like, they didn't know what to do with me, right? Well, they did, but how to behave around a girl. They had their, they were, big boisterous men who loved their work, and it was dangerous work. And so along with that culture came a lot of I don't know, a bravado, I guess. And so being a girl, a young, like 20-year-old young woman going into that environment was challenging for me. It was challenging for them too, though. So, and then the work that I did was also very dangerous, as it was for them as well. And so that was kind of at the beginning of clear-cut logging. That we had moved from sort of like this small scale, slow horse logging, selective logging that had been done like with my family, to this more industrial approach. And so that's what I started in, is looking at or helping them with this clear cutting. And so yeah, and it was in grizzly country, so it was very dangerous. I worked, I worked not only just trying to regenerate these clear cuts with seedlings, but I also helped them lay out roads and cut blocks and do the whole thing that is forestry from harvesting all the way to reforesting. So yeah, it was really interesting, really dangerous, and I loved it.
And at the time, was there any consideration given to the soil and what's going on underground, or was the complete focus purely just on the cellulose?
Yeah, I mean, I would say no. I mean, there were soil scientists, but they were more interested in agriculture at that time. And so forest soils wasn't really a thing that people studied very much. But certainly in the logging industry, their biggest concern was putting in roads and, moving soil and blasting rock to put roads up big steep mountainsides. But the ability of soil to actually grow trees wasn't really thought of that much. But what they did know is that they grew seedlings I helped them plant in soil or in the nursery in these little like sort of rooting mediums and rooting mediums. It's sort of like commercial soils that's not really soil. And when they grew these seedlings in the nursery, you know, they were kind of weird. They had these kind of funny roots that went straight down without little tiny roots coming out of them. They were more focused on the above ground part of the seedling instead of the below ground part. And I think this was part of the problem, as I read in my book, about why those seedlings, when we were first putting them out in these clear cuts, were not doing very well, is because they were just grown without any of their natural, soil or flora and fauna that is associated with soil, real soil.
And you tell a very vivid story of looking at these seedlings that were all dying because they scraped away the topsoil and were planting them in kind of the granular, more mineral soil below it. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe when you first started to realize what might be happening down there and the importance that it could be playing in the health, or in this case, the lack of health of these trees?
Yeah, well, even early on at the beginning of my job when I was 20, and I was, I would go out with the planters and then go after and look at how the seedlings were performing a year and 2 years later. Certainly when the planters planted, back then they used what's called a mattock, and a mattock is like a big axe with a shovel handle on one end and an axe head on the other hand, and they would have to, pull it down, like basically make a hole in the soil. It was brutal work, honestly, but they had to scrape away the forest floor and, as you said, put it in mineral soil, which is kind of cold and granular, and that was the thinking, was that's where all the water and the nutrients were. And we didn't understand that then, I think, that the forest floor, which they were busily scraping away with their mattocks, was full of the fungi and the soil food web that actually cycled nutrients. And so I started, when I was looking at the seedlings not doing well, I would have to pull them out. I mean, that was part of my job, is to figure out what was going wrong. And I would pull them out, and the root systems basically looked a year later like they did when we put them in the ground. They weren't really growing outside of what they're called a plug, the little area that they grew up in the nursery. And so that's what got me started in thinking, what are we doing wrong here? And why do these roots look so different than the naturally regenerated seedlings, which had big roots that went off in all directions? And they had, even though they might look small and tiny from the vantage of standing in the forest, below ground, as I pulled them out, they were huge spider webs of roots and fungi, and very complex. And that's when I started to think, this is where we might be going wrong.
And introduce us to that fungi, because it's got a starring role in your book. What is mycorrhizal fungi?
Yeah, so I talk about this quite a bit and try to describe this so carefully in my book, but there's basically about 4 groups of fungi of which mycorrhizas are one. And so I'll just, tell you that the other 3 there are pathogens, which kill plants and trees. So they're like parasites. There are saprotrophs, so they decompose material. And then there's endophytes, which is a new group that we're studying, in different labs around the world now, which actually live inside of plants. But I was actually these mycorrhizas were not any of those. They were a mutualistic fungus that all of the trees all over the world associate with. They have to. They're in this obligate relationship that is usually mutualistic. It's a symbiosis in that the fungus grows inside the root of the cell of the plant, and there's different kinds of these mycorrhizas. So depending on what kind, it forms this interface with the fungal membrane and the plant cell membrane. And what the fungus does is it grows through the soil, picks up carbon or nutrients and water, brings it back to the plant, and the plant gives the fungus carbohydrate or photosynthate in exchange. It's like this market exchange that goes on. And so the plant is gaining its nutrients and water that it needs, and the fungus, because it doesn't have leaves, gets the photosynthate and does this, in exchange for the job it does of traveling through the soil. And the fungus is huge, right? It's not trivial. Like, there are thousands and thousands of kilometers of fungi in the soil underneath your feet, and they coat every soil particle and every soil pore in order to do this job.
And as you started to pay some attention to them and ask, what is the role they're playing here, you were met with not exactly open curiosity from your colleagues, correct? Can you take us through your kind of early hypotheses and what the reaction was?
Well, so, back then, nobody really thought about mycorrhizas, right? They were these mycorrhizal fungi. They were kind of, like I said, the agriculturalists were thinking about them, but certainly not the foresters. And so I actually didn't talk about it at first, because I just thought, well, that would be even more risky for a girl, being one of the only ones, at least the only one in my company. And so I just kind of kept it to myself, and I started studying, and then, I even bought a microscope and put it in my room, and I would study these roots at night. And I got a book about fungus from the local library, and I started to learn about them. And the more I learned, the more I started to form in my head, we're missing, maybe this is the missing link. Maybe this is what is wrong with the seedlings. And it wasn't until years later, I actually never really talked to the forest industry people about it at all. It wasn't until years later, when I joined the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia as a researcher, that I was actually given the opportunity to look at this in more detail. And then I started talking about it. And I also was doing a lot of reading, and I'd learned about this study that had been done in the United Kingdom, where David Reed, who is a mycologist, somebody who actually studies fungi. I was a forester, right? He was a specialist in these fungi, and he had done this amazing study where he had grown seedlings together in these little garden boxes in the lab, and labeled them with carbon, one of them with carbon-14, and could see that actually the fungi not only associate with a single plant, but they can actually link plants together. And so that's what really got me interested in this topic.
And what ultimately led you to a PhD in the state that is proud to house Powell's, Oregon. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose Oregon State University as the place to study this, and then the shape of that early research, which is, it's so delightful and dangerous and spectacular?
Thank you. Yeah, so I was an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, my home province. And, I was a kid from the woods, so I had to go to the big city to do my undergraduate degree. And it was challenging for me. When I went to Vancouver, I didn't even know how to take the bus. I was just such a backwoods kid. And I finally finished my degree, and I thought, I'm never going to go back there ever again, because it was so difficult. And then I'd heard about Oregon State, because Oregon State, in the hallowed halls of UBC, was like the other forestry school that you could go to, that was like the best forestry school in the world. At least that's what we said and thought, along the West Coast. And it was true. And so I wanted to do my master's. I didn't want to go back to UBC because I'd already been there. And so I applied to Oregon State, and I got accepted. And so I never looked back. I did my master's and my PhD at Oregon State. And so in my PhD, yes, I did this study where I'd learned about this work by David Reed with his plants, his pines in the root boxes in the lab. And I thought, could this be could this be a clue as to why our plantations in Canada were not doing so well? And I'd also, as a researcher, been studying, actually how even, the cultivation practices we use, not just planting, but the brushing of the competitors out of these plantations was actually causing disease in some of these plantations. And I wanted to find out what were we doing that seemed to be so wrong, that was making these plantations, sick and part of the trees dying. And so I did that study for my PhDs. I actually went out in the field and I looked for these networks that David had talked about, that he'd found in the lab. And sure enough, I found that they also existed in our forests, up in our rainforests up in Canada as well.
And I mean, kind of the way it works is you're actually putting plastic bags around trees and infusing them with radioactive carbon and then tracking whether it's flowing into the roots and the bodies of other trees. And maybe dosing yourself a little bit in the process. So.
Trying not to, but accidentally, yes. So I did this experiment where, which was, not really what the Forest Service wanted me to do, because they were so focused on trying to weed out plantations, like weed out the cottonwoods and the birches and the aspens.
And by weeding, it's both like hand pulling as well as literally spraying with herbicides,
spraying
right?
with chemicals or cutting them with chainsaw or clipping them. Or a combination of that would really do the trick. And they were really, so they started spending millions of dollars trying to get rid of these plants. And it all kind of grew out of influence really from Oregon State University, where, that practice had really taken off in planting the Douglas fir forests of the Oregon Coast Range. And so we borrowed that technology to try and grow faster trees, bigger trees in Canada as well. And I just thought that, what about the diversity of this forest? Like, what are we doing here? And seeing the diseases. And so I went back and I wanted to find out, was what David Reed looking at in his little lab studies happening in our forest, and finding that these networks did exist. And then what did they do? And so I actually would put these I would grow seedlings together in these little triplets, Douglas fir, paper birch, which was the evil competitor, and Western red cedar, which at the time was also not considered a commercial valuable tree, but we were very focused on growing Douglas fir. And so I grew these triplets together, and I would, in order to find out if these networks existed and whether or not they were doing anything, I put a plastic bag over the fir, a plastic bag over the birch, and I injected different isotopes of carbon in each one, carbon-14 and carbon-13. And then I was able to, I later would dig up those plants and see where those isotopes went. And it turned out that paper birch was giving a lot of carbon to Douglas fir. Douglas fir was giving some back to paper birch, but it was mostly paper birch donating to fir. And that the more that fir was shaded by paper birch, the more paper birch gave to Douglas fir, which was the antithesis of what the weeding people were saying, right? That birch was just this competitor. But it turns out it was, at the same time it was competing for light, it was collaborating by sharing these resources.
It's not just the antithesis of what foresters believe, but it's kind of the antithesis of what evolution holds, that everything is competing for survival. And maybe you help your own genes and your offspring, but you're certainly not going to be helping a different species. And so at the time, I mean, this research ended up making it into the prestigious science journal Nature and landing on the cover, and they coined the phrase the Wood Wide Web. Can you tell us a little bit about what the response to that was for you? I mean, that should be like a moment of great pride for any PhD candidate. You're on the cover of Nature.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. But I mean, I didn't really, I mean, I knew about the journal Nature, but I didn't know how important it was. And really, because I was so young and I was from Canada, I didn't know that. But I took it all in. And you're right, that there was a big backlash. And it was from the academic side, and it was also from the practicing forester side. From the practicing foresters, it was like they didn't want to change their practices for a whole bunch of reasons. But from the academic side, it did sort of fall in line with Darwinian theory, as you're so aptly described. We were so focused on competition in ecology and the practice of forestry, and that was borrowed from evolutionary theory, that natural selection is based on competition and survival of the fittest. But even Darwin, I think, if he saw how his ideas, his theories were applied, would have said, hey, there's some collaboration that goes on as well, because he did write about that in his early writings. And now we know that competition is still a very strong evolutionary force. There's no doubt about that. But now we know more that collaboration and coevolution has also been very long important. And so people like Dr. Lynn Margulis developed what's called the endosymbiotic theory, where creatures or organisms co-evolve together, and that's what led to the evolution of eukaryotic organisms and ultimately people. And now through other projects like the Human Genome Project, we realize that we're all consortiums of organisms and we're co-evolved as well. And so now it's mainstream knowledge, but back then it was not. It was quite rejected, and I think that my work kind of fell into that argument that was going on at that time about evolution and ecology and the blending of these things to so focus on competition.
And one of the questions in the Q&A kind of fits into this, because a lot of these elements of your work and the response to it thus far are very familiar to anyone who's read Richard Powers' The Overstory. And it's kind of the story of Patricia Westerford. And one of our viewers, Daniel Trefethen, my lisp is going to make this hard, Trefethen, I hope I got that right, Daniel, wants to know to what degree your career was kind of the inspiration for the character of Patricia in The Overstory. And personally, I'm curious, did Richard Powers talk to you about it at all in his writing process, or was that a little bit of a surprise?
It was a total surprise, to be honestly. But I was thrilled to find out that character was actually developed around my character, as well as another forestry scientist. But I since learned. So Richard did a number of interviews, and he was asked who that character was based on, and he said that it was strongly based on my work. And so I think that he gleaned my character and my history from the TED Talks and the things I'd written. But it was a lovely rendition. I mean, it's not, of course, it's based on multiple characters from his past, but certainly Patricia Westerford was interested in and did research on plant communication, but above ground, which is also a fascinating area, and researchers have figured out that trees do communicate through what they call volatile organic compounds, like, these incredible, even when you walk in the forest and you can smell these compounds. These are the trees communicating with each other and all of the other creatures that rely on trees, like the pollinators and so on. So it wasn't quite exactly my work, but it was very close. And then, and also the trouble that Patricia Westerford encountered in her life, the backlash against her work was very much modeled after my own difficulties, I think, as well. And then from there, it kind of diverged, but it was very lovely. Yeah.
And let's pursue that divergence, because once you got a professorship then at University of British Columbia, you went on to map these connections, not just between three trees in a little test plot, but across an entire segment of forest. Paint us a picture of just how extensive this wood wide web is underneath the ground as we're strolling through the trees.
Yeah, so I got a graduate student, Kevin Byler, and I worked with my dear colleague, Dr. Dan Durrell, who I did a lot of work with. And we decided that we were going to address this issue that just remained in the craw of the scientists that were looking at mycorrhizal networks through the 2000s. And the field seemed stuck to me. They were stuck in that we needed to visualize what these networks look like, because to the naked eye they're pretty almost invisible. They in some forests you can see them directly when you look under the forest floor, but in a lot of ecosystems like the coastal systems of Oregon, for example, you could try to find them, but they're hard to see. And so we wanted to show what they looked like, to really dispel this part of the controversy that that they were hard to see. And the other part of the controversy was, what did they do, right? What is there any benefit to, even if there are connections? And so I picked a forest that was what we call an uneven age forest. These are interior forests you would call them east side forests. And so they're drier forests, Douglas fir, and they're self-regenerating forests, meaning that they have all ages of trees where the little ones come up under the old trees. And so I wanted to have that kind of a forest structure. And we knew enough about Douglas fir and the main fungus, which is called rhizopogon, which has been studied extensively at Oregon State, by the way. We had those tools, that knowledge, and we just went into this forest and we took up all the fungal DNA and the tree DNA of 6 forests. And we used that DNA, and it took Kevin 5 years to do this, to create a map showing where each individual fungus was and how it linked individual trees together. And what emerged from that map was that pretty much every tree was linked to every other tree, which was astounding. And not just once, but multiple linkages. Each root had multiple linkages to other trees. And that the biggest trees and the oldest trees were the hubs of those networks, meaning that they were connected to more trees than any of the other smaller trees. And so we started interpreting our data, but doing a number of experiments with these old trees, and found out that the young seedlings, or the seed that was dispersed by these old trees and that would germinate on the forest floor, that within a month or two, they would tap into that big network of the old trees, this mycorrhizal network, and they would start acquiring resources. And this really gave them a big head start. It allowed them to actually survive way better than if they couldn't tap into the network. And so, we started recognizing the value of these big old trees. And we started calling them mother trees because of their nurturing ability in the forest.
And so they're passing back carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen and water. And then you also discovered that they're passing amino acids and what are essentially in our brains neurotransmitters. Can you unpack that a little bit for us and what that means?
Yeah. So I worked with my many students, and we always worked with isotopes, and these are just different formulations of the common nutrients in the forest. And we worked with carbon and nitrogen a lot. And we found that carbon and nitrogen would pass between the trees, along with, as you said, water and phosphorus. But carbon and nitrogen are especially important because they form amino acids. And it's really the amino acids that transmit mostly through the network and are taken up by neighboring plants. And so through the mass balance of the ratio of carbon to nitrogen that moved, we estimated that the main nutrient was glutamate. And glutamate is an amino acid that is actually one of the neurotransmitters in our brains. So you're right, like it is a neurotransmitter, although in the soil, it's an amino acid, right? It doesn't serve as a neurotransmitter because it's not a nervous system, it's not a brain, but the pattern of the network is a biological neural network. That means that the pattern is the same kind of pattern that we have in our brains, where you have, axons and neurons, where there are big hubs and smaller nodes. And that's the beauty of how our brain works. And in the soil, it has the same kind of pattern. And it turns out that this amino acid that is the main one that's moving through the network is this glutamate that is also happens to be one of our neurotransmitters. So that to me was just an incredible discovery.
And you use, in talking of this neural network and this communication, you use the word intelligence. And very specifically, like I feel like for most people that's a very broad term, but it's very specific. Tell us a little bit about what you mean that there's an intelligence to the forest.
Yeah, so I go into a great deal of detail in the book about what this means to me. So, as I said, when we look at the pattern, the mathematical pattern of that neural network in the soil, that was the mycorrhizal network, it is a biological neural network. It does have these glutamate transmitters in them that move through the network. And that structure, that process of communication, or that transmission of that amino acid, those nutrients, it elicits a response or a perception of all the trees to each other, right? It's a way that they communicate with each other, perceive and respond to each other. And it's not just a simple response, like they're actually attuned to the health of their neighbors, where their neighbors are, the kinship, whether they're related to their neighbors, the species of their neighbors, how much resources those neighbors are taking up, whether they're stressed. And the system also because of the way the network is structured, it also makes it very resilient. So that means that the structure actually allows the forest to regenerate, right? It allows the seedlings to tap into this network, receive these messages, and then to rejuvenate the forest. And to me, this is a highly evolved system, right? Like our brains are highly evolved brain systems, organs, and we are highly evolved species. And the forest has got so many conserved patterns that are conserved across evolution that it is an intelligent system. It's got the hallmarks of intelligence. And so I use that word. And it's true that some people don't really like using words like intelligence to describe natural systems like that. But to me, it is the most apt word because it describes this, so efficient system that is resilient and rejuvenating and holds the ecosystem together.
Which really begs the question, as we walk through the forest and take in the trees, are they in turn taking in our presence?
Well, I haven't studied this specifically. So there's a lot of I don't knows in that, but I can tell you what I have done. And so we've done a number of experiments where we've manipulated plants and trees to try to, we've actually tried to kill trees in the lab. We've stressed them out in various ways. We've pulled their needles off. We've bent them over. We've attacked them with budworms. We've infected them with pathogens. And then we've looked at, what are the signals that they're transmitting through their networks to their neighbors. And so one of the things, when you injure a plant, it elicits this biochemical cascade of reactions. And so if you pull a needle off of a plant, if I pull a needle off of a plant, if I clip the needles with a pair of scissors, that cascade of responses happens immediately. So the jasmodic acid pathway, which is a defense enzyme pathway, is triggered, and it starts developing all these defense enzymes and also other defense compounds like monoterpenes. And so that's a human being doing that, injuring that plant, right? It could be a squirrel that cuts off its needles. It could be an insect that's attacking and defoliating the plant, but the plant is sensing this injury. And does the plant know the difference between me clipping the needles off versus a budworm eating the needles? Yes, the responses are a little bit different. They're more dramatic actually when I clip the needles off than when the budworm eats the needles. And so I think that the plant is distinguishing a difference. So I'm going in a roundabout way to say, yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense that they respond. They understand that we're out, that we're doing it there, or that there are other creatures out there doing things to them, and there's a biochemical reaction, a physiological reaction. I haven't. Okay, so that's what I know and where it stops. However, people are, and I would like to do some more research on trying to understand how they're perceiving us in a more, in a deeper way.
We've mostly stopped cutting the old growth forests here in America, although there's some controversial proposed logging in mature forests, and certainly a lot of controversy over salvage and hazard tree logging that's going on a big scale right now after last year's fires. As I understand it, there's still a lot of old growth logging happening in Canada. Given how complex these forests are, what happens when we clear cut them and replant them with little seedlings that have been grown in a nursery?
Well, there's a lot of things that happen. And yes, we are still harvesting old growth in Canada. In fact, it's become, it's a hot issue button right now, because in British Columbia, actually, where these iconic old growth West Coast forests exist, we actually only have 8% of them left. And on Vancouver Island, where the last stands of forests, and people are protesting this now, basically blockading the companies from going in, there's only 3% of these old growth forests left. So there's very little left. And they are being clear cut at a rapid rate. And ultimately, those that are not in parks, which mostly parks cover, small forests or high elevation ice and rock, and they don't really conserve these big old forests. So it's a huge loss, right, to our province, to the people, not to mention the ecosystems. And so let me tell you a little bit about the ecological implications of this. These old growth forests, including those in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, Alaska, British Columbia, these West Coast forests are huge carbon sinks. So they store huge amounts of carbon. They're as important as the Amazon and the boreal forest. And they're also, that carbon storage capacity is correlated with their biodiversity. So they're also very, very diverse. And so they're actually hotspots for conservation. And so that's why people are upset, is because we, not only are we losing, the places that we love, but these are essential forests for dealing with climate change. When we clear cut these forests, there's no way that we don't even account for the carbon losses. We lose carbon immediately from the harvesting of the trees, and then we start to lose some of it from the soil. And almost, about 65% of it is lost almost immediately, because it's converted to, short-term products. And so the conservation of these forests, just from a carbon point of view, is hugely important. And from a biodiversity point of view too, because a lot of species only grow in these forests, right? They're endangered species, they're species at risk, and we're losing these species. So, it's actually kind of, it's great that these two things are related together, because if we could conserve these forests, if we could save these forests, we accomplish two things. We're better able to meet our carbon commitments for reducing the impacts of climate change, and we're also able to save a lot of endangered species, the biodiversity of the forest.
And we have a question from Andy Thrams that is related to this. In knowing all you know about what is happening to these forests as we cut them, and with climate change and wildfire and drought, how do you square that with your own personal feelings? And I mean, I would ask also, where do you find hope?
I have tons of hope. I have two daughters, for one. I have no choice but to be hopeful for them and for all the generations coming up. And just the way that we're, our systems, our social systems, our societies, our ecosystems, these systems are structured to heal, right? I talked a lot about these networks and how they're biological neural networks. Those things are designed for recovery. Just like, I had this huge illness myself that tested my own resolve of hope. And that is that when I went through breast cancer, and I had a network of friends, and it was the resilience in that group that lifted me up. And that is how our systems are wired, right? That's how they've evolved to do that, to heal, to recover. And when you start putting in intelligent policies, you start doing a little thing like decarbonizing and converting to electric cars and using mass transit more, and all those little, they don't seem so little, but they are small steps, add up to a lot until you reach sort of like these exponential changes. And that's how we're designed to recover, right? We start, it goes small, and then all of a sudden you can be these tipping points. And generally, when we talk about tipping points, we're talking about negative things, but they can be very positive as well, right? They can be over a tipping point, and it's all going to fall apart. But we also have tipping points where suddenly it recovers as well and heals. And so that is what gives me hope. And also the ingenuity that we have too, right? We're so smart, and our kids are so smart, and we can do this thing, right? We can shift this.
And our kids, I mean, family is so important in this story, and relationships. And I feel like I highlighted a line that I wanted to share, and now I'm not going to be able to find. Oh, we're defined by our relationships. You write at one point. And to me, it's really interesting the way you then kind of towards the end of the book that you talk about how your research and our understanding of ecology and kind of the Western scientific paradigm is really coming back around to ecological knowledge that has been possessed by indigenous communities in our region for time immemorial. And that is that everything is connected. And this relates to one of the questions we have that is referencing Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a wonderful book exploring a lot of this, where she talks about the cooperation between corn and beans and squash. And so I guess the question that was asked by the audience is, how similar are those relationships to the neural networks you're describing? And there's several other questions that also ask about agriculture and farming or city trees too. Are these relationships and this interconnection, is it taking place everywhere?
Yeah, yes, it is. And yes, we are defined by our relationships in our own social communities and also the forest, because it's a very social place. Trees are defined by their relationships with other creatures as well. And but yes, these networks do occur in agricultural settings. There are different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, but even in the Three Sisters that you're talking about, that Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about corn and beans and squash, how they grew them together, the Three Sisters, that they helped each other out, so that the corn grew tall to capture light. The beans fixed nitrogen took into nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and turned it into usable forms. And then that nitrogen was available to the corn. And the squash sort of was a mulch that held the water in the ground and brought water out and fed the corn and the beans. And so it's a beautiful combination. And that's how I do my gardening too. But those three plants too form mycorrhizas. They form what's called arbuscular mycorrhizas, and they join those plants together. And so it's not just, that they're shading each other and supplying nutrients and water. It's actually transmitting directly through these very complex networks that join them together. And so, yeah, and relationships is, it is how, all plant communities and all, communities, not just of plants and trees, but animals and people, fish, that we're all connected into this one world. And yes, and our Aboriginal people, they've known about this for, like you said, time immemorial, for thousands and thousands of years, because they've been here for, on Haida Gwaii, for example, 14,000 years, and just, practicing in nature and learning about these connections, and then honoring them and cultivating the connections and ensuring that they're whole. And that is what led to, the thriving societies that were here. And that is ultimately, I think, how we are also going to be thrifty again and heal our own environmental problems. Mm-hmm.
And along those lines, what ramifications of your research and other research looking at this, what ramifications do they have for how you think we should be managing our forests? Because we also, as you write, we need wood. And so how should we be going forward in managing how we log or protect or relate to the forests around us?
Yeah, so there's some principles, right? So one of them is knowing the land and knowing the forests. And this is really becoming Indigenous ourselves, right? To really know and respect the land that we live on. Forestry in North America is really, a lot of it, since colonization, has been borrowed from Europe and then adapted to become more economically lucrative, really. And it's led to really the clear cutting, planting, and really disconnection in forests, where we grow these trees. We grow Douglas fir, for example, by itself, without its neighbors, or without neighbors other than other Douglas firs, and really trying to reduce that forest to a few things that are like water, light, nutrients. Trees produce big trees, make lots of money, right? And though that's not a resilient system. So if you get something like Swiss needlecast, or you get Western spruce budworm, or a disease in the forest, those forests are very vulnerable because they're lacking in diversity. And so really what we need to do is make sure that the relationships that are so important in making a resilient forest are intact. And so that means too, leaving the old ones behind as well, so that they provide some of those connections. So old trees, for example, have mycorrhizas that are old growth mycorrhizas. I call them old growth, but they're just older, more abundant, more robust mycorrhizas that are really strong linkers to the rest of the forest. You lose those if you only always grow young forests of just one age and one species. And then these old trees also leave legacies for, like the genes, for example, in their seeds are adapted to like variable climates from the past. And so those seeds will provide robust and healthy and adaptive forests for the future. And so my vision then for forestry is conserving those relationships and conserving those legacies, the old ones, because of their essential role in bootstrapping ecosystems back to healthy systems. And so that means, moving away from this like sort of across the board clear cutting to maintaining old trees, and not just one tree, but groups of trees, families of trees, so they can protect each other. And because one tree alone is really vulnerable, and that is what tends to happen, right? We have this one tree in British Columbia where they tried to leave trees, or these residual trees they called them, and they left one huge tree called Big Lonely Doug. Well, Doug is pretty lonely out there and very vulnerable, and this is not the answer, right? The answer is to have groups of trees, and not always doing the same thing, having those groups designed according to the landscape, according to the forest type that they're in. I could go on and on. There's many things to do, and we shouldn't always do the same thing everywhere, right? We need variety. We need connection at landscape levels. We also need to, you mentioned salvage logging earlier in the program, and old trees, even when they're dying, even when they're on their way out, they're contributing back to the ecosystem. So we've done experiments, for example, that as a tree is dying, that it actually transmits about half of its carbon through its mycorrhizal network straight into neighbors, so seedlings that are growing up around them. If you cut down those trees before they've had the chance to give back to the community, you're actually short-circuiting that natural process and setting the future generations of trees up for, maybe not doing as well. And so, yeah, even salvage logging needs to be reconfigured, I think, following things like wildfires or insect outbreaks, so that these old legacies get left behind to do their good work of bootstrapping that ecosystem into recovery again.
That was a really interesting point for me, because I've always heard, we need to save trees and we shouldn't be salvage logging because they provide habitat for many different animals. But it didn't occur to me that as they're dying, they're still playing a very integral role to their ecosystem and to the trees specifically, not necessarily to the birds and the squirrels and the things that dwell in them.
Yes, all those things are important too. But this is another important part that is pretty new. It's new way for us to think about their importance.
And talking about salvage logging and in particular fire, James Williams has a question of, have you studied trees' response to fire? And I guess what implications your research has for how fire affects forests and what we should be doing about it.
Yeah, I mean, all of the forests in North America have fire plays a role in their vitality and their regenerative ability. They're fire origin forests for the most part. And so, exclusion of fire actually is a really not a very good practice, and that is what we have practiced generally. We try to protect the value of forests for ourselves basically, and our property, and to protect our lives and so on. But fire is an integral part of the vitality of forests, like I said, and fire exclusion has led to all kinds of problems, buildup of fuels, and combined with climate change, this means that fire regimes are changing. We can have more severe fires than maybe historically. So I think that reintroducing fire in a controlled way, so that where it needs to be controlled, like if there's people living around them, around where fires are going to be restarted in ecosystems, it's an important tool that we need to hone, that we need to develop, and to restore our forests so that they're healthy and vibrant again. Because fire suppression leads to sort of like, I don't know, a big understory buildup. It actually starts to sap the remaining trees a little, sometimes in some cases, of their ability to be vigorous. So it's important, but it has to be managed now because we've populated our mountains and river valleys and to such a degree that just letting them go wild isn't an option in much of the country. Or maybe in the boreal forests of Canada you can do that, but generally they would need to be like controlled burns.
And another question we have is, have those fires damaged or destroyed the mycorrhizal networks, or what is the relationship there?
Yeah, no, I mean, the mycorrhizal networks are adapted to fire too, right? So mycorrhizal networks are dependent on living plants. They need photosynthate, and of course, they need spores, and they need to be able to regenerate on these plants that are seeding back in. So it's they're going to come along with the plants as long as the native plants are coming in. The natural mycorrhizal fungi, well, they will the spore rain will still be there. They'll still recover. It can take a while for them to recover. They start out simple, sort of like with a few species, and it takes about 50 years to sort of recover to like an old growth kind of stage, at least 50 years. But they'll be intact as long as there are plants and trees still there. And that's also a good reason for leaving old trees, right? That they still harbor, or they're still host to these, thousands and thousands of species of mycorrhizal fungi. And so, if there's a harvest or if there's a fire, and if a lot of those old trees don't get burned down because they've got thick bark and they're resilient, they're resistant to fire, unlike a lot of our young plantations, then those mycorrhizal fungi are there and they will repopulate the burned areas. If the fire is really severe and burns right down through the forest floor, which is where most of the mycorrhizas are, and we're starting to see some of this in Canada, where the burns can be so severe because of years of fire suppression and climate change and higher temperatures, that in some of those cases where the forest floor is just basically burned to ash, I'm afraid that though in those cases we might have to go and reintroduce some of the mycorrhizal fungi, or it's going to take a little while for them to basically recover.
Which actually links to another question we have, which are there issues with invasive mycorrhizal fungi species, and how different are mycorrhizas networks in different parts of the world? I mean, can you kind of grab from, how close of a forest would you need to grab from for a mycorrhizal transplant?
That's a really great question. So it's an excellent question. So, there were some early studies done, and there are companies out there that actually sell mycorrhizal inoculum. And I think that those inoculums are getting better and better all the time. They're more sophisticated than the first go at it. But those early studies show that when you add mycorrhizal inoculum in a forest setting, like a natural forest, that it doesn't take very long before the natural mycorrhizal community just kind of takes over from the inoculum that's been put in there. And so the native community will take over those weedy species that you might add in as an inoculum. But that inoculum could be important at the beginning if you put it in a planting hole just to get that seedling started. So even though it might disappear within a year or two, it's already done its job, and then it's worthwhile. But yeah, so that inoculum, it some of it can be considered kind of weedy, but I don't think there's a very big concern really about them escaping into the environment, just because the native mycorrhizas will just sort of take over and colonize the native plants on their own. If you were to bring in say, we do have to be careful to a certain extent, because there are disease or pathogens that if you bring in soil, or if your inoculum is not clean, you could introduce a pathogen to the soil. But most of the mycorrhizas would not do that. That would be like an accidental introduction. As far as soil transfers go, that's a really cool thing. I do a lot of that in my own research, and I've actually worked on regenerating a whole mine spoil site using soil transfers from the nearby forest, and it works beautifully. So if you use soil that is from nearby, right? So because the local variants, or the mycorrhizal fungi are locally adapted, the trees are locally adapted, and matching up those locally adapted organisms and that symbiosis is the best thing you can do. So taking the soil from a nearby forest is the best way to go. Put it in a planting hole, put your seedling in it, and it will actually cause, or it will result in a great, beautiful inoculation and diverse fungal community on your plants.
And you don't talk about it in this book that I remember, but I've heard you talk about it in lectures, is the other thing that maybe we'll begin transplanting is trees, that we almost might need to assist them as they migrate in response to climate change. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, that's such an important topic. So, climate change is happening pretty fast, and the velocity of climate change far outpaces the rate at which trees or plants can migrate. And we've been able to figure out how quickly they migrate based on paleoecology studies. So looking at pollen records in, sediments that are stable, and we're able to sort of reconstruct how fast trees have moved historically. And there's no way that they are going to be able to migrate as quickly as they need to keep up with the changing climate. And so the geneticists are working really hard on what's called assisted migration. And I think this is a really good idea, right? It's basically humans helping the forest to migrate. And so taking seedlings from warmer climates and migrating them to cooler climates, because those cooler climates are going to become warmer, over in the coming decades. And actually, I have a project called the Mother Tree Project, where we're doing this very thing, where we're harvesting forest. We're trying to find alternatives to clear cutting, and we're harvesting forests in ways that conserve mother trees and groups of mother trees, and then allowing them to naturally regenerate. But at the same time, we're migrating in genotypes from warmer climates to augment that natural regeneration. And the natural regeneration then works with those migrated seedlings to provide a good, healthy environment for them to begin their lives in. And I think if we didn't do that, like if we just migrated these genotypes from a warm climate to a cooler climate right now, they're extremely vulnerable. At the early parts of their lives, they could get killed by frost in an unusual year, or an unusual frost that year. And then the migration is it can't work. And so if you migrate them into these communities of native plants and naturally regrowing trees at the same time, you can slowly change the community so that it's healthy and resilient, and has a great diversity of a range of genotypes that are going to be adapted to this changing climatic condition.
Thank you. We are running out of, well, we're actually over time, but I would love to end on a question from Paul Haney, that is, what are some of the best ways the average person can get involved in protecting our forest ecosystems?
Oh, that's a really, really great question. I wish I knew the exact answer, and I have tried in many, many ways in my life to do this. But I would say, I've worked in government, I've worked in industry, I've worked as a consultant, I've worked as an academic, and I've tried in so many ways to influence forestry practices so they're more sustainable. And generally, I would say it hasn't worked very well. That, in Canada, we're still clear cutting at unsustainable rates, and it's still clear cutting instead of like more partial cutting. And so how do we do this? And how come we're, I grew up in a province of old growth forests that's now a province of clear cuts. So how do we make the changes? We've only got a few percent left. Well, at this point, I would say, civil action, protests, writing to your governments, to your senators, to your Congress people, to say, this is unacceptable, and there are different ways to do this. And I think that right now you have a government that might be receptive to that. But working on the inside is, we need those people too, but we also need people pressuring your governments, voting, making sure you hold your elected officials to hold their feet to the fire, make sure they fulfill their promises. And we need to do the same thing in Canada. It's all of it is important. We need multiple pronged approaches in order to elicit these kind of changes that we need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for spending your evening with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Those were really great questions.
That was Suzanne Simard and I talking at a Powell's Books event for her new book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. You can find more about Suzanne's work online at themothertreeproject.org. To find out more about our show, Timber Wars, head to opb.org/timberwars. Thanks for listening.